Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, I want to show you a Viking style netting design, but I'm going to make it super easy so that it's accessible for everyone, and I'm going to use a drilled cabochon or an oversized drilled bead. I have got a couple of choices to show you. I've got a round flat coin bead with a large drill aperture, and I've also got a faceted slab to work with. So let's head down to the board and I'll show you both of those designs. So this is the design that we're going to work towards making today. I'm going to demonstrate using a round flat coin bead with a lovely big drill hole aperture there. But it's just exactly the same process that one would use to work with a massive slab. I've got faceted gemstones in stock in sunstone, in citrine and in beautiful charoite. I'm just going to put those out of the way for the moment. And I'm going to show you the first stage that we're going to work towards. The first thing that we're going to need to do is to create a frame. Now I've got a couple of choices to show you. An oval frame is what one would use to have the beautiful big slab. And you'll see because these beads are drilled down the centre, if you were to wear it in this direction, it would just look like the bead is hanging in space, which I think is a beautiful design aesthetic. On the other side, we've got this almost Viking knitting style netting. Now I use exactly the same technique for my dream weaver design, so that's how we're going to achieve this side of the design. If you preferred, you could sew an undrilled cabochon into position quite easily, but I'm going to show you how to attach in a drilled bead. So let's just pop that up into the corner. That's what we're going to work towards. And this is the first stage of what we're going to achieve together. Now I will just say I made a very simple bail on the citrine and apatite piece. It's just a 3 and 3 basket weave looped around and firmly secured together. So that's a really simple design up there. For this example piece, I added some of the beads that I used around the outside to the upright section on that bail. So it's an elaborate bail with a slightly more plain background. That again is a 3 and 3 weave, but it's not a basket weave, it's a straight over and straight under. It's exactly the same as the drilled bead channel set that I use up on the bail frontage on this piece. So I'm going to pop this one out of the way for now, and we'll have a quick look at our bead and then our materials for the day. So this is a Terra agate that I have in stock. It's very, very beautiful, massive drill hole, so you can use whatever wire you want to go through something like that. And for the outer wire, both of the segments that I made in advance were created with 1mm or 18 gauge wire. But I'm going to demonstrate with a slightly heavier wire, and I would suggest that if you're newer to wire work, you do use a slightly heavier wire. So this is around about 15 inches that I'm working with, and that's far more than we need, but it gives us choices with regards to what we want to do with that bail later on. We can change our minds when we get there. So the first thing I'm going to do with my 15 inches, and this is 16 gauge or 1.25mm wire, I'm working in round raw copper. I'm going to warm that very central section so that it's nice and smooth and fluid to get a really good facsimile of the shape of the gemstone. Now because I'm working with a round, this is how I would approach this design. I'd get a good shape going, and then I would ensure that it is a little larger than the form I'm using. So if I just drop that over the top, it's not quite perfectly round, so I would work on making that round. You could use a device if you have one to get a nice round form. You could use ring bending pliers, you could use a ring mandrel if you have one that goes up large enough. Any round form will do to get that nice round shape. For me, I'm just going to form that by hand and be happy with a close facsimile, but it needs to be a little bit larger. So you can see there's a good couple of millimeters all the way around that gemstone. Now I will just flip the design over and show you how much extra space I allowed when using a large faceted slab bead. So this bead is approximately the same size as the citrine I have in the centre that's already been set. There's a lot of space around the edges, at least 2mm on all of the points that would contact if you take into account that I'm making an oval frame for a fancy gemstone shape. So there's lots of space. The frame I'm making is much bigger than the gemstone in question, no matter what shape the gemstone is that we're working with together. So let's just pop that back down out of the way and grab some bent chain nose pliers. I will try and get that just a little more round. As I say, if you have a round form of the correct size, it doesn't need to be a professional tool. It could be anything you have to hand, like the lid of a lotion bottle, for instance. So I'm reasonably happy with that. So I'm going to turn some uprights up at that 12 o'clock position and just get those going up and away from the design. So I don't want to have those bends too close together because I may wish to set some gemstones between them later on. If you set it slightly too wide, that's better than setting it slightly too close together. We don't want to have a tight fit around the gemstone. And again, if you are using a fancy shape, you need lots of space, a good 2 millimeters at the widest points of your gemstone. So that for me is working reasonably well. Now the first half of what we're going to achieve today is adding on some beads around the edge. I have some 4 millimeter round unfaceted drilled black agates, and the wire I'm going to use is 0.5 millimeter, which I'm just unspooling now, and it's 24 gauge. Now if I unspool around about 20 inches, what that will enable me to do is not only add the beads around the outside of the design, sorry, a little bit of notation to myself there, getting in on the action. It will not only allow me to add beads all the way around the edge, but it will give me enough wire to use a continuous piece to add detail to the neckline. So I've only got a couple of beads left, so I'm just going to show you the basic idea of what we're looking to achieve at this stage. I'm going to take my drilled bead out of the equation for the moment, and I'm going to find one end of that 20 or so inches of that finer 0.5 or 24 gauge wire. I'm going to allow myself about 3/4 of an inch, and I'm just going to start by rotating that 3 times around the frame wire to get a really good grab on that frame. So I want the wire to end somewhere on the inside, so I just twist that around until there's very little left, trim the excess away like so, pop it in the pot where it hopefully won't get stood on later, and just smooth that very end bit nice and flat. And then just tighten that up. So I've got 3 visible wraps. My wire is coming off the back, which means once I've added the bead, the residue of that wire will want to come over the front of that frame wire. If your wire's coming off the front of your frame, don't worry, it just means that you'll be going from front to back, and just repeat that same design throughout. So I'm going to find the end of that 20 or so inches of wire. Meanwhile, everything skirts around the desk. Things fall on the floor. Mayhem occurs as usual. So let's add in that first bead and allow that to slip down. Now the reason I'm using a slightly heavier wire is because we want these beads to be nice and secure. Now, one word of caution. While we are here, let's talk about beads and their uses. I adore citrine and blue apatite together. I think it's a colour combination made in heaven. What I did, setting the apatite as the beads around the edge, is I cracked at least 3 of those beads during the making of this example piece. If I had inverted this design and used apatite in that centre and citrine around the outside, there wouldn't have been any dramas whatsoever. Let me just flip that over so you see the other face. So some beads are really, really very strong, for instance agate and quartzes. Jasper is another good one, so mookaite is a nice fancy jasper that you could use. Any of those beads will work really well around the edge, so these black agates are a really good match for what we're asking them to do, which is to be strong and stay where they're put. Faceted blue apatite, not a good choice, other than it looks really pretty. So a word to the wise, think about what gemstones you're going to use where. I could have just gone for citrine and citrine. Citrine's nice and strong. So I'm going to push my 4mm bead onto the frame. As you may recall me mentioning, my finer gauge wire came underneath the frame. So I'm going to push the tail of the wire over the top, and then I'm going to wrap 3 times around that frame. Now what I will say is I don't want to jam-pack beads on this design. I want them to be spread out. So I'm going to allow a bit of an angle to occur on the wire as it comes out of the end of the small bead back towards the frame. So I'm going to pinch that wire where I want it to sit on the design, and then I'm going to take 3 turns with the tail of that finer gauge wire. So I've wrapped 3 times. I'm going to scooch those wires up nice and tight and firm together and just spread that out slightly. Now again, using that 0.5 or 24 gauge, we've got a little bit more strength. If we used a finer wire for this job, we may undo the strength and rigidity of the design. So using a slightly heavier wire, as long as it goes through your bead drill holes, will be perfect. I'm just going to show you one more at this juncture. So find the hole in your bead, allow that to slide all the way down, and make sure that they're well spaced apart around the outside of your framework. At the moment it's still quite mobile, which is no bad thing, because what I think I might do is take you to the opposite shoulder and show you how to add the first bead in that channel setting design up at the top. So imagine, if you will, that we've added beads all the way around the frame, and we're just coming up to add the last bead on the opposite shoulder to where we started, keeping the same distance apart if we possibly can. I'm going to take the wire over the top of the frame. If you open out the very, very top of your bail wires, you'll find that you have a little bit easier of a time just hooking the wire through that gap. So again, I want to pay attention to the angle of the wire coming out of the bead to that frame. Hold that firmly into position and then wrap 3 times around that frame wire. So we're looking at the pendant upside down at the moment, so I'm just going to scooch that as neatly as I can together. I've got my bead set all the way around. What I'm going to do now is flip the tail of my wire onto the upright of those bail wires. I'm just going to pinch with my nail and wrap 3 times around that first shoulder. So we've got 3 visible wraps there. And what I'm going to do now is introduce in the first of my bail beads. So you will have got much less wire to contend with at this stage, because you will have used a lot of it going around the circle of our frame. So let's just find the hole. This is my least favourite part of any demonstration, apart from doing up crimp beads is always nerve-wracking. So let's just scooch that down and apply a little bit of drilled bead channel setting, not the same as any other channel setting you might see. And what we're looking to do is to take the wire across the top of one shoulder bail wire to the top of the other shoulder bail wire. Hold that firmly into position and then wrap 3 times around the opposite side. I'm holding it down with my nail. Once I've got that first bead in situ, I'm going to very carefully tidy up those first 3 wires. There we go. So we're then going to take the wire across the back of the design. I'm going to flip it over for this. Across the back, from the upper side as we're looking at it now to the upper side as we're looking at it now. And what you'll end up with is a pass of wire across the back of the design without any beads or anything on. So let's get that nice and tight, flip it back over, and then we're ready to add in as many beads as we wish. So I'm not going to show you the bail, because I've shown you bails 100,000 times, at least it feels that way. All I would do is put in a number of beads in the same drilled bead channel set fashion, and then take the tails of the wire across the back and tie a couple of times back around the lowest part of those bail wires. There are many, many of my videos here on YouTube that feature how to finish a bail, so if you've not made one before, go and check those out. I don't want to get you bored with the same stuff over and over again. So we're going to move on to the next section now, utilising my already created black agate frame. So with the design I have right here, there is a front and a back, albeit if you wear it in this orientation, it's still really attractive. And that's the idea with many of my pendant designs. I like them to be reversible where possible. This is the feature front though, and this is where we're going to add that Viking style netting, so that we can create almost a Dreamweaver style, in which we can push our cabochon or our drilled feature bead. I'm working again in a slightly heavier wire. Now the reason for this is we're looking for it to be nice and strong and to house a bead, albeit we're going to add our bead on with a length of wire anyway. This is a technique that you can use to set in a cabochon fashion, an undrilled cab if you prefer. So I'm working now with about 28 inches of 0.5mm 24 gauge wire. I'm working in round raw copper. So I want to find a place on which to add. So we've got a little gap here where we very first started the design, adding on the first bead. So I want to wrap around 2 or 3 times in that same position. You can either wrap over the top of your first line of coils, or you can make a tiny space and wrap in adjacent. So we do need a good 3 wraps to get us connected nicely. So I'm going to take that 3rd wrap to the back, making sure that when I bring my cutters into play, I'm very definitely cutting the bit that I want to cut away and nothing else, because it makes one quite tearful when you cut the wrong wire. I'm taking a second to make sure that the tail of the wire is pushed flat down. So what I will do now is teach you how to create that netting design. It's very, very similar to the way that I create Dreamweavers. Now, for it to be visible, I'm going to make this oversized. What I would suggest is that you go 1 bead apart all the way around. So you would bring your wire in a rainbow or an arc shape to that first station. In fact, let's just do that. Let's just go for it. We can zoom in a little bit if necessary. So I've made quite a deep arc over the surface, and I'm coming from the top. So therefore I need to bring the tail of the wire through the centre, so that comes underneath. So I'm going to create a little bit of a curvature there, and I'm creating a nice deep arc into which I'll be able to add wire later. I'm going to pinch that arc into position. Now as I'm going around the outside, I'm going to refer to this layer as level 1 or row 1. So I'm going to push the tail of the wire over, back around into the centre, and I'm going to wrap for a 2nd time in that gap, and I'm making sure that I'm going over the top of those 3 little wraps we did when we added those beads. Doesn't matter if it slips off slightly, and there goes the camera. So I want to repeat a similar shape. So the first thing I'm going to do is push the wire down through the centre, and then I'm going to try and replicate that same shape. So I'm going from the top of the frame wire where we added the bead to underneath the frame wire, also where we added the bead. So I'm going to pinch that form into position, push the tail wire through all the way around and back over the top. It's just a case of repeating all the way around until you get to the end of row 1. So I've repeated that same action all the way around the design, just 1 bead space apart. So I'm going to push the wire all the way through, create my last little rainbow or arc shape, and bring that wire underneath the frame, wrapping twice, pushing it through, and then I'm going to leap across where we made the bail up above. You might need to just fiddle with that to make it to sit as neatly as possible. What I'm going to do then is wrap 1 time around, push the wire through. The next thing I need to do is to bring the tail end of my wire up into the next rainbow. Now this was the first shape we made on row 1. So I'm going to support the tail of the wire, push the end piece up through the middle of that little rainbow shape and draw that all the way round. And what I'm doing here is I'm wrapping around the first side of that small rainbow shape. So I'm going to push the wire through again, maybe just a tiny bit of warmth and straightening, but not too much. Bring the tail up for a 2nd time inside that first rainbow until we get to the very middle peak top of that first rainbow on row 1. We're now going to start row 2. So I'm going to push the wire tail through again, tiny bit of heat and warmth, but not too much. We're working with a relatively fine wire. If you warm it too much, what will happen is you will end up making it brittle. So what we're going to do now is create an arc shape gently, bring the tail of wire up inside our second rainbow on row 1, support that as it comes all the way through, and we're going to make a slightly smaller rainbow shape. Now if your wire goes slightly off, if it's slightly kinked for any reason, you can use round nose pliers at this stage to get a really nice shape. Now by the very nature of we're moving on to our second row, that rainbow shape or that arc shape is going to be slightly smaller. I might want to make that just a tiny bit larger though. There we go. What we're going to do now is pull the wire back towards the direction it came from while supporting the position at which it passes underneath rainbow number 2 on row 1. I'm just going to pull that up and away. So I'm holding that rainbow position on row 2, making sure that it doesn't get distorted, and I'm just going to pinch very, very lightly so that we get an almost knitted like loop coming around. It came underneath, up through that second rainbow on row 1, and I'm going to push the tail of the wire through now and create my second rainbow on row number 2. So to repeat that, the tail comes up inside the next rainbow along. So this is the third form now on row 1. I'm going to support from underneath whilst I draw that wire through cautiously. Very, very gently. You can assist yourself by using your round pliers to get a similar size and shape stitch. And again, I'm going to support the wire where it crosses underneath that third rainbow shape, making a firm loop. I'm then going to draw that slightly back. So you're seeing almost like this. It's just like knitting. You're making loops rather than harsh bends. Push the residue of the wire through the gap. Smooth the wire. Bring the tail up inside the next adjacent row 1 rainbow. So it's passing underneath, up through the form. Now you can see that the wire has gone a little bit out of form, so we very, very gently, using our round nose pliers to generate that rainbow form again. Support the wire whilst you make that loop shape. So we're looping around the first half of the rainbow and pulling it on and so on forwards until you have filled in. If you need to add wire, I will show you that in just a moment, how we can add another piece of wire in. So what I'm going to do is continue using up this small length of wire until I get to the end, so there's nothing wasted, and then I will show you how to add in the next piece of wire should you run out. If you've used 28 inches of that 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, you should be good for about 3 rows, which is just exactly what we need. So you can see that we're getting towards the end of our first section of wire. It's made it round. It was a scrap piece that I had on my desk. And what we're going to do is just utilise the very end of that piece of wire. So if I just lift the top bit up, you can see we've got a very small segment left available. And what we're going to do is exactly the same thing as if we're moving up to the next level, which is to turn the wire one time around the top of the rainbow, like so. Push that all the way around, and then bring the tail up inside the next rainbow level along. So if I just push that through carefully, and hopefully we'll be steady enough to give this a bit of a zoom, I'm going to take that over the top. Now what you're doing when you're wrapping the same gauge of wire around itself is you need to just apply a very delicate touch. So I'm bringing that tail up and through one more time, and I'm just going to make that nice and smooth and get that to sit down behind the design. So this is the front of our design because we've got the beads on here. The back of the design is going to have that gemstone pushed into it. So it needs to be smooth so that it doesn't scratch the gemstone, but it doesn't matter if it's visible because on this side it's going to be hidden. Now if you want to add in another piece of wire, let me just kind of grab a scrap. That's the wrong gauge. Let's grab a correct gauge scrap. So in order to do another row, I think probably at least 12 inches would be in order if it's a much larger pendant. Kind of makes sense to add on 12 inches at a time. What I'm going to do is take my wrapping back a level to just down here where there's a tiny, tiny gap. And what I want is to have the long tail of wire coming over the top, So I'm going to put that into position as if it was going to start the next row. So you can see that we've completed 2 full rows. Incidentally, this is also how we would end a row. So I'm going to show you how to add on some wire, but I'm not going to go all the way around again because frankly this is going to be enough for my design, and also I've shown you how to finish it off now. So we're just going to lay the shortest length over the top of the design and give ourselves a small amount, and we're just going to wrap that away around that very first rainbow. So it's a tiny bit fiddly, but it's not difficult. It's only fiddly because there's a camera in the way. So I'm going to take the tail through and bring the tail up wherever I can and just hide that away. So pushing very, very small movements without deforming those lovely rainbow shapes that we've made. Give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze, and then once that's nice and tidy, we are good to carry on exactly the same way as we levelled up from row 1 to row 2. So I'm going to circle around the rainbow, which is the first position on row 2. Pop the tail of the wire up inside that rainbow, the first rainbow on row 2, pull that through until we get to the centre point on that rainbow, which is position 1 on row 2. I'm then going to push all the way through with the whole of that wire and create my first stitch on row number 3. So you can hear my dogs going off in the background. This is par for the course. There's nothing going on. Maybe there was a sparrow 3 streets away, but that's Joey. He's a tad neurotic. So I'm going to bring the tail of the wire up inside the second rainbow on row number 2, supporting the wire beneath. Draw that all the way around until I have a little tiny rainbow shape. Again, you can use those round nose pliers to very gently guide you into the correct size and shape, and we're looking for loops around the rainbow, not hard shapes. So again, I'm going to push the entirety of the wire all the way through that central aperture. I'm then going to create the next teeny tiny little rainbow. I'm using my nail to just stroke and coerce that wire to a nice round form, bringing the tail of the wire up inside the next rainbow to the right. If you are left-handed, you may wish to start over on the left-hand side and go in the opposite direction. It's entirely up to you. We're just moving around one rainbow at a time. Doesn't really matter which direction we go. So I'm just going to make that a slightly smaller arcing shape. Draw the wire back on itself to generate that lovely loop around the very top part of that rainbow. Just going to squish that down with my nail. And then push the tail of the wire through. As you may have seen on my Dreamweaver video from well over 2 years ago now, you can go all the way to the centre. When you start getting close to the centre, which isn't applicable if you want to show off your wire, your gemstone, but if you do use this as a Dreamweaver design, what you'll need to do instead of pushing the wire through is you'll need to post the front end through, in much the same way as I'm taking the end through now from underneath, up through that next rainbow shape, support it as it comes through, and then use those round nose pliers, which I've got buried under all my other tools, to generate the next small shape, next little shape like so, and then draw the wire back on itself to create that loop around the rainbow. So if you're getting very close to the centre and you don't have any room, you'll have to push the very end of the wire through instead of pushing the leading edge through. So there's always a technique to enable you to get your wire into position. Give that a very, very gentle squish down to make it nice and neat, and then all I'm going to do now is finish my third row and tie off in exactly the way I showed you a moment ago when we came to the end of that first piece of wire. So I've just finished off my third row. Now the number of rows you need to do on a design like this using a Viking style netting technique is entirely dependent on how deep your gemstone is. Because if you're working with an undrilled gemstone and you make too few rows, the gemstone can simply pop out the front of the design, and we don't want that. We want it to be nice and secure. I'm teaching you today with a drilled gemstone anyway, so there's very little risk. It's a great way to get a feel for the design and to kind of play around with the tolerances that this Viking style netting design can give to you. So if you'd like to join me down at the board again, I'll just show you how to finish off that last row again. So you can see I've just finished my third row of Viking style netting. So the wires come over the top. I'm going to push that tail end up inside the end of the preceding row, making sure that my loops, my little rainbow shapes, are of a similar size. It doesn't have to be identical, but of a similar size all the way around. I'm then going to push the wire through the centre for the very last time, and then bring the tail up inside position 1 on row 3. So I just bring that all the way through. You can make your life easy by cutting this a little bit, but I want to show you what it's like with the full length of wire. You can push that last bit through for a second time. And then just, if I flip this over, what we're going to do is trim this away. You'll find that the wire has become quite tense. Again, making sure that you position your pliers look before you make that cut. It's very painful when something like that goes wrong. And then what we're going to do is use the fine tip of our chain nose pliers to just squish that last tiny bit nice and flat. So just chase it in the direction that the wire is travelling. You might need to come from underneath, whichever works best, and just get that nice and secure. So we've wrapped twice around the last little rainbow shape. Just going to get that looking as smooth as possible. It's virtually imperceptible. You will have this little trail of wire. Let me see if I can show you on this one. No, it's gone in the other direction. I did this one left-handed. So you can see that there's a little trail of wire where you're moving up from row 1 to row 2 to row 3. That's all part and parcel of the design. That's not a fail on your part. You're supposed to be able to see that extra little bit of wire. So in and of itself, that's quite a pretty little design. If you keep going until it gets to the very, very centre, you could add a couple of small beads in there. You've made yourself a dream weaver, which there is a full video for. It was one of my earlier video tutorials, so hopefully you will enjoy that also. It didn't have the beads around the edge, so this is something a little bit different for you. What we're going to do now is just flip it over and look at the underside. Now, if you were smart and you used 16 gauge wire, when you start to push the Dream Weaver section forwards, or the Viking style netting forwards, it won't pull your frame out of shape. If you did work with 18 gauge or 1mm wire, you just need to be super careful that you're not making the frame change shape. So I'm going to pop my chosen bead into position and just push that into the netting so that it comes slightly forwards. Like so. If I just hold that up to the camera, you'll see that I'm just pushing that inside the frame. So if I then remove the gemstone, you'll see that it's got a bit of a dishing to it, which is exactly what we want to happen. Now, because this is an absolute beginner's design, we're then going to wire the gemstone into position. If you want to do a cyclic design, you absolutely can, but like I said, this is for total beginners. So I'm going to find some 0.6mm or 22 gauge wire. There's a very large drill hole in this, so you could use a slightly heavier gauge wire if you prefer. I'm using a 0.6 or 22 gauge because it snuggles away on the frame quite easily. One thing I will say is don't get these tiny little end bits caught in your thumbs. It's quite painful when that happens. I know for where I speak. So what I'm going to do is pop the wire through my gemstone, but not all the way out the other side. What I want to do is to get this to sit really inside that dish we've made. So I want the threading wire that's going through that bead to go on the front side of the frame. So if I just flip this over, you can see the tail of the wire that's gone through the bead is on the front of that frame wire, and that's on purpose. I will then retract the wire through from the other side and do the exact same thing. You might want to slightly bend that forward. I know that just went blurry, and just push that through. So what you will see is that this holds that bead, a drilled cabochon if you prefer, in position really neatly, and it pushes it forwards into that meshed design. It's only a matter of a 1mm difference, but it makes all the difference with how it looks. So you can take a little bit of time to make sure that the wire comes through in a similar position on either side. I'm not overly worried because I'm just showing you the technique. So my wire is coming out between 2 and 3 on this side and between 3 and 4 on this side. You might want to take the time to try and get that to sit more accurately, more evenly. In fact, why don't we do that? Let's just move that over a slight amount. Just push that through so it comes forwards of the wire again. Let's just get that to go through. And I need to just bend that down slightly as it pops through so that it's on the front of the design. And then I'm going to draw that upwards so it's slightly higher in position. You might need to just yoink that through with your pliers. Wherever you get it to sit, it doesn't really matter because we're using that lighter wire. It's actually gone back to 3 on this side and 2 on that side. That's where it wants to sit. I'm not going to stop it. So what we need to do now is simply wrap around the frame wire 2 or 3 times using that ever so slightly heavier wire, which is the 0.6 or 22 gauge. It's still relatively invisible, but it's just a little bit stronger. So I'm just going to show you on one end. All we're going to do is wrap twice around that original round shaped frame. I used probably about 6 inches of this wire just to give me plenty. There'll be an offcut, but it just means it's easier to show you. So I'm going to draw that around for a second time, cut the wire away with just a tiny bit of excess. And then I can take that excess and post it down inside that frame. I do exactly the same thing on the other end, and what you will end up with, hopefully, is one of these. So it looks for all the world like a meshed or netted cabochon set, but we've cheated and we've used a wire. As I mentioned earlier, if you're slightly more advanced or you want to give it a go, you could go for a slightly cyclic design just to spiderweb that in, or you could make 2 frames exactly the same, one with beads, one without, and then you can do another little bit of that cabochon netting design, that kind of Norse netting if you like, or Viking netting, and then just bring those 2 half frames together and wind around with a lighter gauge wire. So you do have some choices, but as a complete piece, this is what we've made today. My other one will still be dual faced, albeit it will be an interesting look on this side, but it will still have that I'm just hanging around gemstone kind of look to it. It'll be a magical look. Slightly less comfortable to wear against the body with that on that side, which is why I like to have the gemstone against the body in pendant wear. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed the beaded Viking style netting pendant design with me today. Do feel free to drop me a like on the video, give me a subscribe if you like the content. All of the links to my socials are down below in the video description. I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now.